Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast with Mike and Mike. Sales is a thinking process. This podcast will help you learn about what works in sales, how to hone your skills, and increase your success. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry. This week, Mike Simmons is with us. How are you doing, Mike?
Jody, I am doing great.
Well, it is always a pleasure to have you on the show, Mike.
Well, thank you. I don't know that it would be a show if you and I didn't show up, right?
No, I don't think it would be. I don't know what it would be, but back to the show. I hear Mike Simmons talk often about continuous learning, about how you should always seek out new knowledge, don't settle. But lately, I've heard Mike talk about infinite learning, and that's what I want to talk about this episode. Mike, what is the difference between continuous learning and infinite learning?
I don't know, and I'm still kind of trying to figure it out. And where infinite learning came up, I first was exposed to it or heard it described on a Masters of Scale podcast with Diller. And they were talking about the concept of learning to unlearn. And I never really thought about the importance of beginning with a blank slate as you go into each individual discussion that you have or individual experience. And I know we've talked before, and one of the guiding principles for Catalyst Sale is not to limit yourselves or the solution that you deliver to your customer based on preconceived notions. So part of that is kind of unlearning or beginning with a blank slate. But I thought the discussion that Reid and Barry had around this, and we'll include a link in the show notes, was really interesting. And this whole concept of how do you unlearn what you've learned so that it doesn't cloud your judgment as you look to innovate inside a new space.
Well, that's interesting. When I look at how you've always preached continuous learning, now you're saying you might need to actually unlearn some of the things you have learned during continuous learning. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah. So for me, continuous learning is grounded in having a natural curiosity in others, in things, we've talked a bit about pattern recognition and identifying patterns and seeing how things in one context might apply to others. So from a continuous learning perspective, I've always looked at it, and I know there are others out there who may have a similar point of view, is if I'm not learning, I'm not getting better. If I'm not learning, I'm not advancing. If I'm not learning, I'm not moving forward. And that's what I've always thought about with the idea of continuous learning. I always want to be learning. I always want to be consuming new information. When you get into infinite learning, the thing that was kind of interesting about that concept to me, or the thing that is interesting about that concept to me, is more of like a learning loop, how this thing loops back and how you've got to unlearn concepts, or the idea that comes to mind for me is a blank slate, be able to go in with a beginner's mind into a new situation and take that beginner's mind perspective so that your judgment is not clouded by a preconceived notion, by the idea of, hey, I expect to see this. And I think on some other episodes, we've talked about it before, the whole idea of counting the number of basketballs that are being bounced in a video and nobody sees the bear in a costume that walks in the background. If we start anticipating the things that we expect to see, it clouds our judgment on what the reality is. And that happens both. I think you can apply the same concept when it comes to learning. So to unlearn, to remove those preconceived notions, I think is a really important aspect to it. And again, this is something that I'm just starting to think about a bit more based on the discussion that was on the podcast. What comes to mind for you, Jody, when you hear the idea of infinite learning versus continuous learning? Does it sound like just another marketing thing, or does it sound like something that you can apply practically?
Well, I had not heard this term before you brought it up, and so I'm still trying to work through it in my mind. But one thing that does come to mind is I've mentioned before that I used to be a park ranger, a law enforcement park ranger. So I had to go to the law enforcement academy, and I had never shot a handgun prior to being in the law enforcement academy. And which at first was a little intimidating to think, oh my goodness, there's a lot of guys here that are very good already. And I've never shot a handgun. But what happened was the people that were already good sometimes struggled because they are very particular in how they teach it and how you have to do it. but I didn't have any background in it. I didn't have any knowledge. I'd never learned anything about it. I just did what they told me, and I did very well. But the people that already had learned this quite often had one of two things. They either had knowledge that didn't apply to what we were learning right now, or they just had bad habits that had to be broken before they could do this the way we were supposed to do it. So when you talk about clean slate, that's the first one that comes to mind. I was fortunate enough to show up with an absolute clean slate and didn't have anything to fall back on. I had no choice but to just do what they taught me.
Well, and you're kind of describing my golf swing. It is one bad habit after another. And I probably have done more to help my golf game by not playing golf in the last couple of years than continuing to practice bad habits. And, you hear these concepts before. You'll have to learn you have to learn to unlearn what you have learned. And I forget where that quote specifically comes from. It probably comes from some movie, but when we go into a new client implementation, as an example, or we bring on new sales reps into our team, or we start thinking about going after a new market, we usually will start with a blank whiteboard, and we'll start to write up ideas and concepts and thoughts about what we think we know about the market and where the sources come from. If we went in there and said, for every market that we go into, that everybody is going to have this specific role, everybody is going to have this specific job function, everybody is going to have this specific product, everybody is going to buy using this specific process, all we would do is create these templated approaches that remove the thought out of being a sales professional or developing a market. And those preconceived notions can cloud your judgment. So that to me is the other thing. And I kind of feel like I'm restating some of the stuff that we started talking about at the beginning of the podcast around, but that whole idea of how do I force my mind to empty? How do I force my mind to take the beginner's mindset point of view so that I don't limit myself to following a trail or following something that I would expect? And one of the ways that I do that is by sticking to the simple questions. Who is impacted? Why are they impacted? How are they impacted? When are they impacted? Where are they impacted? And not coming up with something more detailed or convoluted about how to ask those questions, but sticking with the basics: the who, the what, the why, the where, the when, the how, and then let the story unfold and start to tell itself.
Well, this example you give of going into a client, that's one thing. I have another question for you. Some learning is built upon other learning. For example, Economics 201, you would take that class to go back to college days after taking Economics 101. So what do you think about that? If some learning is built upon other learning, how do you apply the infinite learning concept when some of what you have to learn relies on other things you have learned?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I mean, for me personally, and again, not an expert in this, so probably shouldn't even be talking about it, but I think what I hope this turns into is a more open dialogue around within the community of people who are listening to this podcast, and they can engage with us both on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever it makes sense to them to engage with us. But there is always going to be a fit for things like successive approximation and moving from one step to another, or building a foundation and then being able to move to the next phase. You're not going to go in and build a cathedral the first time you start doing some woodworking. It isn't going to happen. I think the first woodworking thing that I made was a plank that had some writing built into it and used a router to create a neat edge. I'm not going to be able to frame a house. So there's always a place for building on previous experience and building on previous knowledge. So I think that'll always be there. But I think the question comes in when you start to think about how can you be creative in these new environments, and how do you apply learning from other scenarios, but not be clouded based on the thoughts and ideas that someone is trying to deliver to you in a given point in time. And I kind of feel like I'm rambling a little bit here, but just to tighten up the point a little bit, I would say you are going to learn to walk before you run. You're not going to get past that. You are going to learn to run before you learn to sprint. And if you try to sprint before learning to walk, you're not going to be successful. So maybe this doesn't have a place in everything. I don't know.
Well, I see where you're going at here. You have to have the knowledge. You have to build that knowledge base, but you can't go into every situation and say, I know exactly how this is going to turn out because I've seen something like it before. Because everybody is different. Every situation is different. Some of your past knowledge, your past learning might help you along, but you can't just enter into a meeting and say, oh, this is exactly how this is going to go. It all goes back to some early episodes where you would talk about how dangerous it can be to use scripts in your sales calls because you're talking to an individual there. You can't just lead them down the exact same conversation you've had with 12 other people that day. So that's my thought on where this is heading and maybe what you're getting at. But let me just ask it directly. How does what you're telling us about infinite learning, how does it impact sales?
Well, I think it impacts sales by giving you that break, that timepiece, that check, that pause that forces you to say, how much of what I'm doing today or how much of what I think I see today is based on assumptions or expectations of what I anticipate I should hear or see or think based on previous experience. The previous experience is really important, but if you take that pause and ask yourself, what am I missing? What didn't I see? Where are my gaps? You can open up your eyes to other opportunities and maybe some other connections that you can make to other scenarios that you've walked through on your own. So I don't know that I think my takeaway on this whole thing is rather than looking at continuous learning as an ongoing progression that is always moving forward, sometimes you have to take a couple of steps backward and you have to ask yourself, you have to take that point of view of that beginner's mind and ask yourself, what am I missing? What's different? Get back to the basic questions, those who, what, why, where, when, and how type questions.
Well, this is good. And I want to give us a takeaway, something we can walk away with and say, okay, now this I can do a little bit different. So what final advice do you have? You've taught us about infinite learning, but what can we actually change? What can we do a little differently starting tomorrow based on this idea?
I don't know that I've really taught us much about infinite learning other than just bringing to focus the concept that I heard on a podcast where Reid Hoffman was interviewing Diller. So I don't want to present myself as an expert. I certainly am not. And I think as you listen to this, you're probably saying, "Yep, I can see that." But as far as the takeaway I would say is remind yourself to go back to that point of the early curiosity that you have in each of the situations or scenarios that you're engaged with. Take that beginner's mind approach. Take a break. Let your mind wander. Go back to some of the basic questions. Who is this thing impacting? Who is important in the market? How do they do what they do today? How might our current solution work inside that context? How might I learn how to ask better questions? How might I learn to be a better listener? How might I apply some of this idea of beginning with a blank slate and applying it inside a current role and really asking the question? I think another question I would ask is, what could I do differently? And if I'm comfortable with asking myself, what can I do differently? I'm taking personal ownership on the success of this thing that I'm working on and realizing that I don't have all the answers. And many times as we move further and further along that spectrum of expertise, we feel like we know all of the answers. And sometimes we don't listen as much as we need to. So a couple of the takeaways: take a blank slate approach more often than not. Ask more questions more often than not. Make sure that you're listening more often than not. And engage with us in the community. I'd really like to hear everybody else's thoughts on this idea of infinite learning and how you're applying it, and really how it's changed your perspective on your current role and what you would do differently today in your role than you may have done yesterday because you've now started with a blank slate.
And how could we engage with you about this?
The best way, and there's multiple ways, I'll say the best way is probably through Twitter, just because we're pretty active on Twitter at Catalyst Sale. Beyond that, hello@catalystsale.com is our email address. We do have a Facebook page that we're active on. We're starting to become more active in Instagram as well. So just interact with us in any place that you interact with others and comment to Catalyst Sale, and we'll find you there.
Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you for listening to the Catalyst Sale podcast.